Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as my manner is, we've got a great show for you today. I'm very excited. This happens every week when I do my show prep and get ready for the show. I get excited about doing the show because there's just so much cool stuff that is related to our topic, which, for those of you that have not heard my show before, is all about the Nativity. Okay, it's really just that simple. God Save the King is about telling, or frankly, retelling the biblical nativity story the way it really would have happened. And we're going to talk more about Roman culture tonight, taking up kind of where we left off from the two previous episodes. But I want to take a second to review a couple of ideas with you to help kind of create a larger perspective of what's going on here. And that is, what I'm about to say should be review. My target audience here is primarily Bible-believing Christians, primarily, not exclusively, not by a long stretch. And I hope that maybe we have, people who are just curious about biblical history or the history of that era that are watching the show. And you don't have to be a follower of Christ. You don't have to be a believer to watch this show. But I realize that most people who do watch the show probably are, right? So if you're not, welcome. I'm really glad you're here. I'm glad you're intrigued. I'm glad you're interested. And we're going to talk about Roman religion tonight. Okay, and I'll tell you why we're going to talk about Roman religion. And like I said, this is dovetailing into the previous couple of episodes, and that's because God Save the King, like I said, is all about telling, or frankly, retelling the biblical nativity story the way it really would have happened. Now, that is in contrast to the traditional nativity story, or what I might frankly start calling the Christmas story. So if you hear me say nativity story versus Christmas story, I'm doing that deliberately. That is a contrast, because one is the genuine. The other, frankly, is I hate to say this, it's the counterfeit. The traditional nativity story actually bears very little resemblance to the way the birth of Jesus really would have happened. And that's why when I said at the very beginning of the show, I'm excited, is because this is a never-ending quest to nail this down, to talk about what this really would have looked like, instead of this conveniently packaged, commercialized fairy tale, because that's really what it is, okay? Children's story, caricature of reality that we are fed every Christmas season, air quotes for those of you that are audio only, right? This is really an amazing story if you will put it in its cultural context. If you will put it in its cultural context, that is the key, because the modern traditional nativity story has developed over time, and it developed over time because it got away from the context in which it happened. Okay, the cultural context, the historical context, the social context, religious context of when it happened. We have to, frankly, immerse ourselves in that context in order to understand what this really would have looked like. I shared several weeks ago, I did an episode where I talked about a thought experiment where if you could travel backwards in time and you were to travel back to the middle of the 1st century, and you were to actually get an opportunity to interview Matthew or Luke, who are the two gospel writers that wrote the infancy narratives, right? Mark doesn't have an infancy narrative. John doesn't have an infancy narrative, but Matthew and Luke do. Okay, so if you had the opportunity to interview either Matthew or Luke and you sat down with them and you got past the hurdles of, unbelief that this was actually possible, and one of them turned to you and said, okay, well, what do you want to talk about? And you were to just blurt out, okay, not watching your words, and you were to just blurt out, hey, I want you to tell me about the first Christmas, right? They would look at you and go, the what? Oh, what are you talking about? I don't understand. I don't understand the question. The first Christmas. No, I don't know the first what? I don't know that word. Christmas. I don't know. I don't understand. See, because that is a word that was invented hundreds of years later. Okay, according to our cultural context, or a closer to our cultural context, a Western European Latin tradition cultural context, many hundred years later is when we came up with the word Christmas, okay, which means a mass for Christ, okay? And that gets us into the whole mass issue. What is a mass, right? The whole Western Roman tradition, the Latin tradition, or also called the Roman Catholic tradition, that developed the mass in the Western part of the empire, because they were the ones that predominantly led to this. The Eastern Empire did too. There's a lot of traditions in the Orthodox side of things, the Eastern side of the Roman Empire after the split, okay? But their traditions are slightly different. For one thing, they don't use the same date. So that's interesting right there, because see, that is at the heart of this investigation is, well, wait a second, was he or wasn't he born on December 25th? Because according to the Bible, it simply doesn't say. There is no explicit date given. The fact of his birth is discussed, but the day and time is not explicitly given. It's not even implicitly given. Now, it may be cryptically supplied, which I believe it is, in Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, and that's a subject for another day, but not explicit, not implicit. The fact of it is there, but not any information. So the date, so December 25th just simply isn't mentioned. The word Christmas is not in the Bible. The date December 25th is not in the Bible. That he was born in the winter is not in the Bible. None of that's there, right? So if his birth date is discoverable, then we have to discover it by investigating other evidence that will lead us to a reasonable conclusion about when he was born. Well, that evidence is primarily the Bible itself. Now, we can put the Bible, here you go, we can put the Bible in its context. That is a key component, right? Because if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, if you are a Bible-believing Christian, we've all read Hebrews 1, which reads that God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, right? So God spoke. That's one of the things we can take away from that verse, is that God is speaking, God is communicating, right? And then this is Bible 101. There's also 1 Peter, or actually 2 Peter, my mistake. Here I can just get done saying it's Bible 101. It's actually 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 21, talks about how no prophecy came by the will of man, but holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. See, so Hebrews 1 tells us that God spoke. 2 Peter 1:21 tells us that men spoke as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. So the reason I'm mentioning that is because God has a message that went through a human filter. Okay, so it wasn't automatic writing. He didn't say, hey, Paul, take a letter, and then Paul just wrote it down and it just went straight from God to his pen, right? It had to go through his personality, his character, and what he thought and believed, and the day and time that he lived in. So an enormous key to help us understand what these men are writing, and therefore what God is saying, is that we have to immerse ourselves in the world that they lived in. Okay? We have to try to learn as much as we can about the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, before the Common Era and the 1st century Common Era, right? Or BC and AD, right? As much as you can learn about those 2 centuries will help you understand the New Testament in general and the Nativity in particular. This is also known as the Second Temple period. Okay, the Second Temple period, because you're talking about the nation of Israel, or what would at the time would have been called the Kingdom of Judea. The Kingdom of Judea in the Bible lands, in what we would now call Israel, and yet it was part of the Roman Empire, was another dominant cultural piece of the puzzle. And then over to the east was the Parthian Empire, which is another big piece of the cultural puzzle. So all totaled, you've got the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean. So you've got Rome, you've got Asia Minor, you've got Greece, you've got Syria, you've got Judea, you've got Egypt, you've got Nabatea, what we today we would call Arabia, and then you've got the Parthian Empire and all those territories to the east. The ancient Near East is the cultural context that we are talking about. So the reason this is so important is because we frequently make the mistake of trying to interpret Scripture by looking backwards through our modern cultural filter, right? Or, and if not our modern cultural filter, we look backwards through a concept that was invented or developed between then and now, right? So in other words, we're looking backwards, right? Timeline goes this way. We're looking backwards. There's a viewfinder in between us and the event that is shaped by something that happened, in 500 AD or 1000 AD, right? Like, for example, just very briefly use this as an example. When St. Francis of Assisi developed the first that we're aware of live nativity play, that wound up influencing other nativity plays after it. Okay? So if he had something dramatically incorrect and then that wound up influencing other things, the temptation, is to look backwards through that filter and, not realizing that it's not correct, superimpose those things on the story that we're reading, right? So, for example, and I'm just using these as examples, in the record in Luke, where we are told that Mary laid the newborn Jesus in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn, right? We use our modern mindset and we go, inn, Holiday Inn, motel, commercial travelers inn. There was no room for them in the motel, right? And so they must have gotten turned away by the night manager, right? Well, no motel is mentioned, no night manager is mentioned. And so if we're making that assumption, we're making an incorrect assumption, and we're doing it because of our modern culture. See, we're not putting it in its culture back then when travelers' inns, they existed, but they were few and far between. They were a day's journey between one another, 20 miles apart, because that's typically how far you could get in a day, right? So there might be a traveler's inn here, but then there wouldn't be another one for 20 miles. Was pretty common, right? Also in Bethlehem is way too small to require a traveler's inn. And then there's the whole issue of laid him in a manger because there's no room in the motel. No room in the guest room. And then we do another cultural faux pas, which is, well, what's a manger? A manger is a food or water trough for animals. Well, where do you find a food or animal trough for waters? Well, you find that in a barn or a stable, right? Yeah, in Western culture you do, but not in Judean culture, right? See, so this is frankly, it's the perfect example of making a common error, which is we are superimposing our culture on the biblical culture and then looking for answers and not finding them because we don't stop and slow down and go, okay, well, what was it like back then? What was their culture like? See? And while to a certain degree, those details are not critical, if they are handled improperly, they can affect your theology. You'll wind up inventing a theology to go with the mind picture that you're assuming this is what it looks like, when in reality, maybe it doesn't, right? Because how many nativity plays make a big deal out of Jesus and Mary being turned away from the motel when there's no biblical record that they were turned away from a motel? That isn't what happened. That isn't how it went down. Jesus was born in a traditional Judean home surrounded by midwives and other female family members and friends and stuff like that. He was born in a very loving, friendly environment, not in some dank stable with barnyard animals surrounding him. That isn't what happened, right? So now if you develop a theology based on that, you can see on the error, right? I mean, every year at the holiday season, I see some article online about how they were outcasts. They were rejected. They were turned away from Bethlehem. They were turned away from their hometown, right? Well, no, they weren't turned away from their hometown. That isn't what the Bible says. And culturally, that's the point. Culturally, if we supply the correct cultural picture, it was a hospitality culture. Right? They would have walked into the town square, they would have sat down, and someone would have approached them and said, do you need a place to stay? It was a hospitality culture. See, so there is a huge example of why we need to completely and utterly re-examine the nativity story in light of trying to superimpose our culture on an ancient foreign culture. That was an ancient foreign culture, and we need to, like I said, we need to try to immerse ourselves in that culture so that we can see what this really would have looked like, right? So Judean culture, of course, would have been the predominant culture of the Bible writers, but as I've already indicated, there were other influential cultures. The Parthian Empire and the Parthian culture, Arabian culture, Egyptian culture, and Roman culture would have influenced the big picture, right? And the likelihood is that they actually influenced the big picture way more than we realize. And again, part of the reason for that is because we don't know what to look for. We haven't done our job. We have not immersed ourselves in that culture so that we can see the hints and the indicators and the evidence when it pops up, and it might be right in front of you, but if you don't know what to look for, you're going to miss it. Okay. Now, we've already talked about this in a previous segment, because what I want to talk about is I want to talk about Roman religion in general and the Roman Imperial cult in particular. Okay. And like I said, the reason we don't see this is because we don't know what to look for. But see, a Jewish person living in Judea during the Second Temple era in the 1st century BC, leading up to the birth of Jesus, would have been influenced by Roman culture. You couldn't have not been influenced. Now, were they, did they understand all of it? No, right? But they would have had more in common with a contemporary but different culture than they would with our culture. Judea would have had far more in common with Rome than Judea would have in common with 21st century America. There's no question, right? So understanding these adjacent cultures, very, very, very important, because if you understand it and you know what to look for, you're going to get some new information popping out at you out of Scripture and go, oh my word, I didn't realize that was there. Okay, so that's what we want to do. I want to talk about Roman religion and the Roman Imperial cult most importantly, because it's actually right there. Okay. So talked about this in previous episodes, a little bit of review, a little bit of overview here. Couple things to remember about Roman religion. Number one, there's no such thing as secular society. Okay. This was not a secular society. It was a religious society. Now, it was not religion the way we think about religion. It was the way they thought about religion. Okay, so that's why we have to study their religion to know what they believed and what things would have looked like to them, how they would have perceived them, how they would have processed them, how they would have understood them. Okay, not our mindset, their mindset. Okay, so there was no such thing as a secular society. The Roman religion was not only the popular religion, in other words, the religion of the populace, it was also the state religion. Okay, everything was the purview of the gods. Everything. Your day-to-day life. And that didn't matter whether you were, a slave, or whether you were a merchant, or whether you were a senator. Everything about your day-to-day life was the purview of the gods. Okay, so it was a state religion. Now, part of the reason I want you to be aware of that is because that means failure to keep their religious ideals would have been looked upon as a kind of treason because it was the state religion. And then you can flip it over as well and vice versa and say, well, if you're committing treason, well, then treason wasn't simply a civil violation. It was also a religious violation. See, so it gets, they had very different ideas that are unfamiliar to us. And we need to familiarize ourselves with how they thought and what they thought and how they process stuff, because then the story's going to jump off the page at us and go, oh my word, oh, look at that right there. Oh my word, there it is right there. Okay. So it was a state religion. Okay. It was a pantheon. The Romans, like pretty much everybody else in the region, believed in multiple gods, lots of gods, a pantheon of gods, right? Pantheon, pantheos, multiple gods, okay? A pantheon. Now, something interesting, I'll make a brief little comment right here. With all the neighboring nations basically being polytheistic, right? If you and your neighbor are both polytheistic, you didn't always have a reason to fight each other right away, because the gods that I choose or need to worship within my pantheon are probably also in your pantheon. Okay? So when you had polytheistic religions and polytheistic neighbors like this, it's not that they got along. It's just that you didn't have this instantaneous reason to be offended because no one was claiming exclusivity. But if you had a monotheistic religion, that's a little different. See, and that's what the Jews were. The Jews were a monotheistic religion that was claiming exclusivity and saying, we're right, y'all. We're right. You guys are wrong. Our God is the one true God. All your gods are not gods. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, in the spirit of an overview, here's a couple things to keep in mind. Most religions at that time had a sacred calendar. Okay. Now, like I just said a second ago, the religion in Rome was also the state religion. So the calendar, it wasn't necessarily the religious calendar, but it was the religious calendar. It wasn't necessarily the state calendar, but it was the state calendar. It wasn't necessarily just the popular calendar, but it did all of these things. It did all of these things. Okay. But very important, their calendar was very different than ours. They did not use calendars the way we do. Okay? They did not have a universal calendar that everybody understood. Time was localized, right? I'm reading a really interesting book that talks about this. until you can travel quick enough that you can go a distance and arrive in another location and it's a different time of day, you would never notice, right? So the bare minimum that would take would be very fast, like horse travel, might actually result in you getting a perspective that, oh, well, I traveled, I traveled west, right? Okay. And nothing really changed because I was keeping pace with the movement of time. Whereas if I traveled east, it got dark quicker, right? Okay. But it's only in the modern era, okay, with, mechanical travel that we can travel quickly, that affects our conception of time. See? And while that is minutes and hours, it also translates into days and weeks, and therefore it does translate into the calendar as well, right? So my point being is that time was local. So over here in this city, in this culture, you've got this calendar and you've got these gods. But in this city over there, you've got this calendar and these gods. And those calendars didn't line up because the calendar was local. It was local to them. See? So they didn't have this notion of universal timekeeping. That's very, very modern. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. The fact that we have a modern universal calendar that we think differently. We treat that very, very differently, right? But they had, so as a pantheon, they got a religious calendar. They had lots and lots of temples that you could worship in, or where you could sacrifice or make an offering to your god, right? Et cetera, et cetera. But the Romans, here you go. This is why I'm mentioning all this. The Romans absolutely believed that the proper maintenance of the gods was everybody's responsibility. Okay. It was an individual responsibility. It was also a state responsibility. So the proper maintenance of the gods would in turn, so you do your duty in taking care of the gods and giving the gods what they need and desire and demand. And then the gods will do their job in taking care of the state, taking care of the society, taking care of the people. Okay. Very, very, very interesting. Now, in light of that, we need to talk about, because here's this cultural thing again, we need to talk about a particular word, several words actually, but one word in particular, because we have this word in English and they had the word in ancient Latin, and it's the same word, but it doesn't automatically mean the same thing. So this is another place where this cultural distinction and cultural shift from our modern Western culture to an ancient Eastern culture, right? An ancient Mediterranean culture really matters, is because we might be throwing around the same word and we might think it means something that it doesn't mean. See? Very important. So what I want to talk to you about is I want to talk to you briefly about the English word cult. Okay, C-U-L-T, the English word cult, or 2,000 years ago in Latin. I mean, in Latin, it's still the same word. Doesn't matter whether it's today or 2,000 years ago. In Latin, the word would have been cultus, C-U-L-T-U-S, cultus, okay? And see, in its most basic sense, all right, in its most basic sense, cult or cultus etymologically means simply it means the system of religious devotion or veneration of a deity or of a person or of an object, right? It was the cult was the system of veneration. That's what a cult was. See, a much later meaning, okay, the much later meaning is that, like in modern English, when we hear cult, we go, oh, well, that's a religious group whose level of devotion or their beliefs or practices or all of the above are regarded as unorthodox or strange or even sinister. That's occult. But that's not what we're talking about. In Latin, cultus simply meant the system of serving the gods or caring for the gods. So you want to clear it up real quick. I want you to think about the word cultivation, right? What does cultivation mean, right? Well, to cultivate means to take care of something, and that's what it is. It's the care of the gods. The cult of Jupiter, for example, would have been the care, the devotion and the care, the honor and the worship that Jupiter requires, demands, desires, etc., etc., etc. So it's very important that we divorce ourselves from these different meanings, that this modern, a religious cult is this screwball group over there. That's not what we're talking about at all. The ancient Roman word cult, and then also the academic use of the word cult, is very different. I'm going to be using those. So you need to be aware of that. There's a lot of people that when they talk about this subject, they deliberately avoid using the word because they want to avoid the confusion. I, however, am going to use it. Okay. And isn't it interesting? Very, very, very interesting, right? That we're talking about culture. Okay. Because it's the same root word. Okay. And we're talking about how you can't take our modern culture and superimpose it on an ancient culture, because the filter will be completely off and you will not see what it is you need to see. You need to look at their culture for what it is, right? And their culture, right? So that means their social behaviors, their institutions, their knowledge, their beliefs, their art, their laws, their customs, their attitudes, all of that shaped their culture, right? And a huge big piece of the puzzle was how they honored, were devoted to, worshiped, and cared for their gods. And that is simply the cult of their god. Okay, right? Or gods, plural, right? Okay, now, very important, like I said, that we don't get stuck misunderstanding that. Okay, because I'm going to use the word cult, and I do not mean a modern, lunatic fringe group. I mean the ancient methodology of maintaining deities, right? Of the system of devotion. Okay. Now, I mentioned briefly that we're going to be looking at the Roman calendar. Okay. And like I said, on one hand, it was a state calendar, but it was also a religious calendar. It was also a social calendar. Everybody used it, but their calendar was not like our calendar. It wasn't universal. Calendars were local. Okay. Now, I would bet money that part of the reason we're going to talk about what we're about to talk about is because the Roman Empire kept getting bigger. Okay. And the fact that therefore there was a need to recalibrate the calendar, because not all ancient cultures took note of the fact that the lunar calendar and the solar calendar don't line up. Or maybe that's the wrong way of saying it. It's frankly, they probably did notice, is probably the better way of saying it, but they didn't know how to harmonize it. They didn't know how to make that work, right? So prior to the 1st century BC, the Roman calendar was pretty messed up, right? It was only 300 and I forget, I didn't write it down. It was only like 355 days long, right? Not 365 days long, which meant, after 355 days, you wouldn't be landing back at the same day, right? And a lot of ancient calendars struggled with this, where they had what were called intercalary months, which means they had to insert either extra days or extra months in order to get the calendar to harmonize with the distinctions between a lunar and a solar year, right? But like I said, the calendar It was a state function, it was a religious function, it was a social function, but because it was partly religious, it fell under the purview of the priests. The priests were the ones who had to make the decisions about if and when the calendar needed to be changed. Because remember, they were all of every aspect of life was the purview of the gods. Every aspect of life was the purview of the gods. Therefore, you had to take care of the gods so the gods would take care of you. And then if the gods took care of you, then you would have an orderly society and a decent life, right? It was just that simple. That's what they thought. That's what they thought. Okay. And if something was wrong, well, then that means, you did not do your due diligence with the gods in the proper way. So if the calendar is going to aid you in serving the gods and therefore having a well-ordered society, well, by all means, you're going to take care of that, and you're going to have officials that are going to oversee it, right? So the Romans were no different. Their priesthood were the ones who oversaw this, and Julius Caesar was appointed Pontifex Maximus in 63 BC, okay, which is basically the equivalent of the head of the Roman religion, or the high priest or the chief priest, okay? Now, 63 was a very interesting year, and some very significant things happened in 63. I mentioned this in another episode. Mithridates VI of Pontus, who had been a thorn in the side of the Romans for decades, was finally defeated and killed. That happened in 63 BC. Julius Caesar was appointed Pontifex Maximus in 63 BC. Pompey Magnus captured Jerusalem in 63 BC. And then Gaius Octavius Thurinus, the man who became known eventually as Augustus Caesar, was born in 63 BC. And I'll devote an episode at some point to just this year, because there's so much that happened in this year. But part of the reason I'm bringing it up the way I am is to point out the fact that without a universal calendar, what someone living in that day and time would not have said would have been, well, in the year 63, that was when, no, they wouldn't talk like that. They would have automatically connected the year to an event. They would have said, well, in the year that Pompey Magnus captured Jerusalem, that same year, such and such. Okay? So there's this, my point being is there's this very different understanding of their calendar and ours, and how we use the calendar and how they use the calendar. Okay? So Julius Caesar instituted reforms to the calendar. He among others noticed, hey, the calendar doesn't line up with the year properly. We need to fix it. And it was Julius Caesar who suggested a 365-day year with a leap year every fourth year. That he was the guy that, the best of my knowledge, was the first one to come up with that idea, right? And that's called the Julian calendar. He suggested it in 46 BC, and then it was put into effect in 45 BC. And then a little over a year later, he was assassinated, okay? A little bit about the terminology of the Roman calendar. Now, this isn't critical. You don't got to memorize this or anything like that, but it's helpful for us to be familiar with it. Each month in the Roman calendar had 3 fixed days. One was called the calends. That was on the first of the month. The second was called the nones. And then the third was called the ides. Okay. Now the calends was always the first day of the month, but the nones or the ides varied slightly depending upon which month you were in, because the months had different numbers of days. Okay. So the nones were early in the month. They were 5 to 7 days into the beginning of the month. And then the ides were at the middle of the month. Okay. But depending upon exactly how many days were in the month, determined when the nones or when the ides would fall. Okay, but the calends was always the first day of the month. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because every once in a while I may have to use that terminology, or maybe I read a quote, right, that talks about one of those things. You won't be totally in the dark about how the Roman calendar worked. Okay. Also, another thing to know about the Roman calendar is they counted backwards. Okay. So it would be as if they didn't do this exactly, it would be as if instead of today being January 9th, today was the what? Do the math, the 22nd, right? And then tomorrow's the 21st, and then the 20th, right? Okay. But what they did is they counted down, they counted backwards to these fixed days. So that was why they would use phraseology like, it was 8 days before the calends of January. Okay, that's because they're counting down backwards, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, boom, calends of January, right? That was how they did it. That was how they expressed it, right? And then also they were inclusive. Okay, so 8 days included both days at the end. In other words, they counted inclusively. So my point being is that actually is a quote, right? 8 days before the calends of January is December 25th, because it would go 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 31, 31, first, right? That's 8 days before the calends of January, right? So, like I said, there's not going to be a test. You don't have to have this memorized. But they thought about calendars very differently than the way we do. And then that's the Julian calendar. And then there were some modifications made to that in the 16th century that were made by Pope Gregory the 13th. That's what's called the Gregorian calendar, which is still essentially the calendar. So the combination of the Julian and or Gregorian calendar are basically the calendars that we use today. Okay, now, so why am I mentioning this? Well, because the calendar is what allowed them their religious celebration. Because in Roman religion, okay, they celebrated anniversaries in a big way. Okay, the anniversary of a thing, okay, different things, was a very big deal. Okay, now one of the most common types of anniversaries that were celebrated was the founding or the beginning of a person, place, or thing. So, for example, the founding of the city of Rome was a big deal. That was a religious celebration. See, so they would celebrate that anniversary every year. The anniversary of the founding of Rome. Okay, the founding of a temple would be a big deal, and then of course, a person's birthday would be a big deal. Now, all of these in Latin were called dies natalis. Okay, D-I-E-S, dies, natalis, N-A-T-A-L-I-S, dies natalis. Okay, that phrase is used to refer to any of these things because the word natalis, which is where we get our English word natal, means the day or the location or both of the origin of a thing. Your natal day is the date or location of an origin or a beginning. Okay, so it technically means natal day, right? But then it basically means birthday. Okay, right? But the point being, here you go. The point being is that to the Romans, birthdays were religious occasions. Okay? Here we are, modern 20th, first century Western culture. Never once in my life have I been to a birthday party where the birthday party was considered a religious event, that there was a religious obligation to observe this day. It's always been cultural. Here you go. Culturally, we celebrate the birthday. We celebrate the person. We say, hey, we're really glad that you're a friend. We're really glad you're a family member. I'm glad that you're in my life. I celebrate you. right? But we don't like offer sacrifice to the gods, right? Now, in Christian circles, there might be prayer on your birthday where people thank God for your life, or you thank God for your life, right? But generally speaking, birthdays don't have this religious overtone in Western culture, okay? Not so in the Roman religion. In the Roman religion, your birthday was a holy day, okay? And so you celebrated the anniversary. That was a really big deal, right? But there were also prayers that were offered. There was incense that was burned, and then there were offerings that were dedicated to the gods. Okay? This was a requirement. This was really, really, really important as part of the Roman celebration of a birthday. Now, interestingly enough, they also gave gifts and they also celebrated with cake. Okay, that's part of a Roman thing. Okay, but my point being is that the celebration of a Roman birthday was a religious thing. It was a religious thing. Okay, now I'm going to run out of time if I don't speed up here. So I just said that the celebration of a Roman birthday was a big deal and that offerings would be offered to the gods. Okay, well, logical question. Which God? What God? What God are we talking about? Are we talking all the gods, one of the gods, two of the gods, 5, 10, whatever? Okay. Well, also in the Roman religion, each person and or family had their own tutelary deity. Now, tutelary is just a fancy word that means guardian. Okay. They had a guardian deity or a guardian spirit. Okay. Frankly, what we would call maybe a guardian angel, although they're not exactly the same. This was a minor deity. Okay. Okay. And it was your guardian. It was your guardian spirit, and it was always with you. It was your attendant, right? It attended you from the moment of your birth to the moment of your death. And therefore, the proper maintenance of your guardian spirit, your guardian deity, was extremely important. And you had to do this annually, okay, in order to keep yourself on good terms with your guardian spirit, your guardian deity that protected your life. Okay, so you had to offer prayers, you had to burn incense, you had to offer a libation or a drink offering, which, oh yeah, that's the origin of what we now call a toast. Okay, because you would have a cup of wine and you would drink a little wine, and yeah, your friends would be there celebrating with you, and you would offer a libation offering to your tutelary deity, right? And you would drink some of the wine, then you'd pour some of it out for the deity, for the gods, for the gods. See? So this is a big deal. It's a religious ceremony on your birthday that you would honor the gods and that you would honor your guardian spirit. Okay. Now, this is very, very, very interesting. What was this guardian spirit called? And in Latin, the guardian spirit is called a genius. Genius. That's right. We get a loan word in English from this word. In Latin, it's called a genius. Okay. Now, the genius is the male version of this guardian spirit. Okay. The female version of the guardian spirit is called a Juno. Okay. So you've got genius and Juno, right? Now, because the Roman pantheon was patterned after a human family, okay, the father god is Jupiter, right? And then the mother goddess is Juno, right? Jupiter and Juno were the mother and father goddess of the Roman pantheon, right? So that also means that for the male, sometimes your guardian spirit would simply be called your Jupiter, right? And they didn't mean the Father God, they meant your patron deity, right? And of course, each person had an individual one, but then the family had one, especially the pater familias, the father of the household, right? And then also the mater familias, the mother of the household. They had their deities as well, these household gods, these household deities. Now, take note, you probably have already figured this out. Genius, right? Okay, well, genius is the singular. In plural, it's genii. Okay, Genii is the plural. I don't know how it's pronounced in Latin. Genie, right? Okay. In Arabic, this is a jinn, right? Okay, Jinn, right? I dream of genie. That's where we get this. That is where this is from. And then in Greek, the equivalent is daimon, right? So anybody who's ever looked into biblical Greek, and you know about the word daimon, your mind is going woo, because there's all kinds of really interesting associations that go on. Okay, now I've just realized that I am going to run out of time, so I'm not going to try to cram all this in, right? But I want to keep talking until I'm officially out of time and lead you towards why I am bringing this up and why this is significant. Because the point being is that if you time travel back to the 1st century BC or the 1st century AD, and you live in Judea, and you're a Judean, you're a Jew, okay, and you live in Jerusalem, or you live, wherever, right? Bethlehem or Nazareth. You live in Galilee, okay? Or maybe you live in Damascus, or maybe you live in Antioch, right? Because not all Jews were in the promised land at that time. They had started to spread out, right? But the dominant culture is the Roman culture, right? With other cultures weighing in, Egyptian, Arabian, Parthian, Syrian, other cultures weighing in, right? There would always be this influence. Now, you might not know every detail about every other culture. Of course not, right? But when you're the client kingdom of a dominant empire, you're going to know a little bit about what goes on in Rome, especially when you have a leader like Herod, okay? Because what is Herod doing? Herod is building temples. He's building temples to Augustus, right? He's building cities that he is naming for Augustus, right? So we're aware that he built 1, 2, 3 temples for Augustus in Israel, right? One was in Sebast, right? Now, Sebast, by the word, is the Greek equivalent of Augustus, right? And Sebast was what he named Samaria, the city of Samaria, right? Herod, that was one of the first cities he invested a lot of money in, was in rebuilding Samaria, because Samaria had been destroyed by different Judean kings for different reasons over the years. So Herod invested a lot of money in rebuilding Samaria, and he built a temple to Augustus in Samaria, but he used the Greek name. He called it Sebast, okay? And then he also built a temple to Augustus in Caesarea, right? And that's Caesarea Maritima, right? Now, this is very important because, see, Herod built a city, right? What's important to the Romans? The anniversary of the founding of a temple, a city, a birthday, a person, etc., right? Caesarea Maritima didn't exist. Israel did not have a deep water port. And Herod wanted a deep water port to increase trade, so he built a port and built a city that he dedicated to Caesar. Okay? See, so this is a big deal. So Roman culture is invading Israel. It's all over the place. So he built one in Sebast. He built one in Caesarea. He also built one near his son is the one who built Caesarea Philippi, right? And there is a temple that actually was not only discovered in the last, 10 years, right? It's up in that general area. It's in northern Israel. It's near Mount Hermon, okay? It's near the gates of Hades, right? And that whole thing where there's a temple that Herod built to Augustus in that area, right? It's not right there, but it's nearby. But Herod built, like I said, he built 3 temples to Augustus, right? Named cities for Augustus. So my point being is that this Roman influence is there. You can't not be influenced by it, okay? Now, I'm going to cliffhang you. We're going to stop right there. I got about a minute left to wrap this up and say goodbye for the night. So I'm going to cliffhang you there, but I want you to check back in next week because we're going to continue talking about this, because if you're observant, you probably got an idea where this is going, because the point being is that if you live in this culture is influencing you. Okay? And that's why over and over throughout Scripture, God pointed out to the Jews they were not to be like their neighbors. They had a lot in similar that was very similar, but they also had a lot that was distinct, and that was the point, was to not be like them. So anyway, I am now officially out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. My name is Tim Kies. This has been God Save the King.